Wyoming Territory, 1878. The wind bit cold across the open dirt square of Bitter Creek as the auctioneer slammed his hand down on the post and shouted, "Next up, one healthy female, 23 years of age, no husband, no debts, no kin. Startin' at $50. Flora Tate stood on the wooden platform, hands bound in front of her with coarse rope, the bruises on her wrists raw from travel. Her brown hair was tangled from the wagon ride, and her dress hung loose on her thin frame. She did not cry. She had done that already on the third day after being dragged from her farm in Kansas, after the bank took her land, and after the man who brought her here said he would sell her off to pay his drinking debts. She kept her chin raised, even as the crowd of rough men in dust-covered clothes shuffled closer. Some laughed. One whistled. Another called out a bid. 55. 60. 65. She looked to the horizon, heart pounding, praying to no one in particular. Just let it be over quick. Let whoever wins be too poor or too tired to bother hurting her more. Then a voice cut through the noise. Calm. Deep. "I'll take her." The crowd fell still. A tall man on horseback nudged his sorrel forward through the crowd. He wore a wide-brimmed hat tipped low, a brown duster, and a revolver on each hip. His face was sun-worn, jaw shadowed with stubble. The horse stopped at the edge of the platform, and the man swung down and walked up like he had all the time in the world. "I said I'll take her," he repeated to the auctioneer. "No bidding. I'll pay double." The auctioneer blinked. "Double? That's $200. The man pulled a thick roll of bills from his coat and peeled them off without hesitation. "Cash." Flora stared at him. Her breath hitched. She had never seen him before. He did not look at her like the others had. He looked at her like she was a person. The auctioneer snapped his mouth shut and took the money. "She's yours." The man stepped up to her. He pulled a knife from his belt and sliced the rope from her wrists. His voice softened. "You all right?" She nodded stiffly. "I'm Thatcher Grady," he said. "You do not owe me anything. You want to ride out of here with me, I've got room. If not, you tell me where to take you and I will take you there." Flora's legs wobbled. She had not eaten in 2 days. She stared at him, trying to find some angle, some catch. There had to be one. But his eyes were steady. "Kind. I have nowhere," she whispered. Thatcher gave one nod. "Then come with me." He helped her down from the platform as the crowd grumbled and broke apart. Flora followed him to the horse, half-dazed. He lifted her gently into the saddle, then mounted behind her. The town faded behind them. They rode west, the land stretching wide and open, sagebrush running like waves. He did not speak much, just guided the horse, steady and patient. She leaned back against his chest without meaning to. He smelled like leather, dust, and pine. They stopped at dusk near a creek. He built a fire, handed her a clean tin cup of coffee, and gave her a blanket without asking questions. She sat close to the flames, the warmth finally chasing the cold from her bones. "Why did you do it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Thatcher looked across the fire at her. "I have a sister. She died 5 years ago. If someone had tried to sell her like that, I would have burned the whole town down." Flora held his gaze. "I could not leave you there, Flora." She swallowed. "How did you know my name?" He smiled a little. "You said it when the man dragged you into the station. You kicked and shouted, and I heard it. I remembered." That night, she dreamed of her mother's voice, and for the first time since she had been taken, she did not wake up crying. They traveled together the next day, and the one after. He never touched her without asking. When she needed to stop, he stopped. When she needed quiet, he gave her silence. On the third day, they reached his ranch modest, tucked against the edge of the forest with a wooden fence and a small red barn. 2 horses ran the pasture. "You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. Used to be my father's place. Took it over after he passed. Flora stood in the doorway of his house. It smelled like cedar and bread. She blinked hard. Felt like a home. Thatcher showed her the spare bedroom. You can stay as long as you want. No expectations, no strings. I just want you safe. Later, he brought her tea and left it at her door. She held the warm cup in her hands and sat on the bed, staring at the lamp flickering on the table. No one had ever done what he did. No one had looked at her, seen her pain, and chosen kindness. The next day she helped him with breakfast. She chopped onions while he stirred the eggs. They moved around each other easily, like they had done it 100 times. When he brushed her arm by accident, she felt it all the way to her ribs. Thank you, she said quietly. Thatcher met her eyes. For what? For seeing me. He paused, then reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. How could I not? Flora's heart beat so loud she was sure he could hear it. She did not know what this was, not yet. But she knew it was more than safety. It was something she had thought she would never feel again, hope. The frost settled in light on the porch rails come morning, thin and silver in the pale dawn. Flora stood at the threshold, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, watching the breath rise from the horses in the pasture. There was stillness in the way the land seemed to wait, the way the sky held its color just a little longer before the sun made its way up the ridge. Thatcher came from the barn, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sleeves damp from the pump. You sleep all right? I kept the lamp on, she said. Didn't mean to, just... It helped. He nodded, not pushing into the silence that followed. The wind moved the dry grass, and the chickens stirred in their coop. You keep animals for meat? She asked, glancing toward the goats penned in beside the small shed. Milk mostly, that and barter. There's a man out near Bridger who trades salt pork for goat's milk come winter. We keep one another fed. Flora stepped down onto the packed earth and followed him toward the barn. The smell inside was warm and close, hay and animal hide and old wood. She held her hands out over the lantern he'd lit near the tack wall. Did you mean it? She asked. Thatcher ran a hand over the back of the roan gelding. Mean what? That I don't owe you anything. He looked over his shoulder, then back to the horse's flank. I don't say things I don't mean. She watched the way his hand moved slow and even through the horse's coat, the way his touch calmed the animal without effort. A man doesn't pay that much for a stranger without expecting something back. I'm not most men. You've made that plain. He turned then, eyes steady on hers beneath the brim of his hat. You've got reason not to trust. I don't blame you for it. But this is your place as long as you want it. You make your own choices here. The weight of that settled in her chest choice. It hadn't been hers in a long time. Later, while Thatcher repaired the fence along the south pasture, Flora found the root cellar and took stock of the jars lined neat against the stone wall. She set aside flour, dried beans, and lard, then lit the stove with trembling hands. The matches slipped once, but she kept at it until the flame caught. By midday, the scent of cornbread filled the house. She stirred the stew slowly, careful not to waste a thing. Her fingers burned from where she'd scraped the pot clean, but she didn't mind. The rhythm of it steadied her, gave shape to the hours. When he came in, boots heavy on the floorboards, he stopped at the doorway to the kitchen. You cooked. There was no use letting the beans spoil. He stepped closer, then paused. You didn't have to. I know. They ate in quiet, the kind that didn't press. She watched the way he folded his hands before he picked up his spoon, the way he chewed slow and thoughtful. When he finished, he set the bowl down gentle, like the table might bruise. You always lived this far out? After the war, I didn't want cities. Needed quiet. She hesitated. You fought. Union. Missouri Regiment. Lost too many good men. She didn't ask more. He didn't offer more. But something in the way he stared into the fire after made her think of long roads and longer nights, the kind that leave something behind in a man's bones. That evening, she asked if she could help with the mending. He brought her a small basket of shirts worn at the cuffs and knees torn from brush. She sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, needle in hand, while he read a worn copy of Homer's Odyssey by lamplight. "You read," she said, surprised at herself for speaking. "Never stopped, even when I wanted to. I never learned past the Bible. My mother taught us letters, but there wasn't time for more." He closed the book. "I could teach you if you like." She looked at him full then, the quiet certainty in his offer, no pride in it, just the plain truth of a man willing to share what he had. "I'd like that." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin like the soft edge of a song. She sewed until her eyes blurred, the steady rise and fall of the needle like breath, like heartbeat. He didn't speak again, just stayed close. When she rose to take the candle, her fingers brushed his as she passed. He didn't pull away, neither did she. That night the lamp stayed dark. Still she slept. The snow came sudden that year, a thick fall overnight that blanketed the hills and muffled the world. Flora woke to the hush of it, the glass panes rimed with frost and the roof creaking low under the weight. She stood at the window, her breath fogging the pane, watching the white gather along the fence rails and tree limbs. Thatcher had already gone out, his tracks fresh in the snow leading toward the barn. She found his coat still warm on its peg and pulled it over her shoulders before stepping out. The cold bit sharp, but she didn't flinch. Past the barn, he was cutting a path to the root cellar with a shovel, his breath rising in clouds. "You need a second pair of hands?" she called. He looked up, surprised. "You'll freeze. I've seen worse winters." She picked up a smaller shovel from beside the door and joined him. "And I've got all my fingers still." They worked in rhythm, the snow heavy but clean. When they reached the cellar door, he stepped aside to let her open it. The hinges groaned, but the inside was dry. "You always keep it this stocked?" she asked, glancing at the shelves. "Started putting things up in August. Never know when a storm'll roll in early." She nodded, then handed up a sack of potatoes. "You always prepare for the worst?" "I don't like scrambling when trouble comes." They hauled the food up in silence, the kind that didn't strain. Once back inside, Thatcher stoked the fire while Flora set the kettle on the stove. Her hands stung as the warmth returned, but she welcomed it. He watched her unlace her boots with careful fingers. "You ever think of going back east?" She glanced up. "There's no one left there." He waited. "My younger brother passed from fever. After that, it was just me and the land." She folded her hands, knuckles red from the cold. "I kept it running 2 years alone. Thought I'd make it." "You did more than most could." "Didn't stop them from taking it." He didn't offer comfort, just nodded as if to say he understood that kind of loss in his bones. After breakfast, he brought out a small wooden box, its hinges worn, the corners rubbed smooth from years of handling. "This was my mother's," he said, placing it on the table. "She taught me my letters from the newspaper scraps she saved in here." Flora opened the lid slowly. Inside were folded pages, yellowed and soft. A few had pressed flowers tucked between the lines. "I don't know where to begin," she said, almost to herself. He leaned over, close but not touching. "Start with a name. Yours. Then the date. I'll guide you." She dipped the nib into ink, hesitating over the blank page. Her fingers trembled from more than the cold. "Go slow," he said. "You've got time now." She shaped the letters carefully, mouth moving silent with each one. When she finished, she looked up. "Feels strange, putting it down like that." It's yours now. No one can take that. She stared at the page a moment longer, then closed the book softly. That night, the wind howled against the shutters, but the fire stayed high. Flora sat cross-legged on the floor, mending the seam of a wool skirt. Thatcher sat nearby, carving a piece of pine into the rough shape of a spoon. "You always whittle at night?" she asked, squinting at the thread. "Helps me think." "What do you think about?" He paused, blade halted mid-stroke. "Lately?" She nodded. He looked at her, really looked. "How easy it is, having you here." Color rose to her cheeks, sudden and warm. "It's not been easy for me, but you make it feel like it could be." He set the knife down. "You don't owe me anything, Flora. Not your thanks. Not your trust." She folded the skirt in her lap. "I know. That's why it means something." The kettle hissed softly as it cooled. Outside, the snow deepened. He reached for her hand. Not sudden, not bold, just steady. She let him. In that quiet space between the fire's crackle and the wind's moan, they held on. Not because they had to, because they chose to. By late January, the air carried a different weight, less sharp, more still. The snow no longer fell in heavy sheets but drifted in thin veils, and the creek behind the pasture began to sing beneath its crust of ice. Days passed slow, marked by the small tasks of winter. Splitting kindling, boiling linens, brushing the horses' coats until they shone like river stones. One afternoon, Flora stood at the wooden table, sleeves rolled, grinding dried horehound in a small mortar. Thatcher sat by the hearth, oiling the leather of his saddle straps. The stove crackled between them, and outside, a hawk circled wide over the bare cottonwoods. "You were quiet at supper last night," she said. His cloth paused over the stirrup. "Didn't mean to be. Just caught myself thinking." "About what?" He took his time answering. "May's coming. I'll need to ride out to Rawlins, check on my cattle lease near the Sweetwater. Could be gone near 2 weeks." She set down the pestle. "You go alone?" "Usually." She turned toward him, hands light on the table's edge. "Do you want company this time?" He looked up. "You offering?" "I'm asking if you'd want me with you." His eyes held hers a moment longer, then softened. "I'd be glad for it." She nodded once, then reached for the jar of honey. "Then I'll make sure the pantry's ready before we go." Later that evening, they sat at the desk by the front window, the last of the light casting long shadows across the floor. Thatcher bent over a sheet of paper, drawing a rough map of the route west, his fingers smudged with charcoal. Flora watched the lines take shape, the way he marked a crossing by a crooked pine and a rise near a shale bluff. "You always draw your own maps?" she asked. "Can't always trust what's printed. Land changes faster than ink." She leaned closer, brushing her hand over the edge of the paper. "What's this here?" "Old Crow's Hollow. Used to be a mining camp. Empty now, but the well still runs clean." She traced the line with her finger. "You've known this land a long time." He nodded. "Since I was 16. She looked at him fully then. "Where were you before that?" Thatcher leaned back, folding the map. "Arkansas. My mother's people had a farm there, but drought leveled it. My father rode north looking for work and never went back." "You followed him?" He nodded. "He wasn't much for raising boys, but he taught me how to lay fence and hold my word." Flora ran her thumb along the grain of the desk. "You ever think about leaving this place?" "Sometimes, but it's the only ground I've ever buried kin in." She understood that. There were places back in Kansas she hadn't looked at in years but still carried behind her ribs. "I'd like to see the Sweetwater," she said. "You will." The next morning, they hitched the wagon for a supply run to a neighbor's homestead 5 miles east. The road was narrow, rutted with frozen tracks, and the wind carried the smell of pine sap and old earth. Halfway there, the wheel caught a stone and jostled hard. Flora clutched the sideboard. "You reckon it'll hold?" "She's stubborn," Thatcher said, patting the mule's flank. "Doesn't give up easy." At the neighbor's place, a German widow named Mrs. Eckhart traded them a crate of dried apples for 2 jars of lye soap. She eyed Flora's hands as she passed the basket over. "You spin your own thread?" "Not since last spring, but I could if the weather turned." "Then you've got good sense," the widow said, with a small nod of approval. "The men out here get by on grit. The women survive on skill." On the ride back, Flora sat quiet for a long stretch, the road winding between snowbanks. Finally, she said, "You think we'll be all right, Thatcher?" "Out there on the trail." He guided the mule around a rut before answering. "I think you've got more steel in you than most men I've known. I think we'll do just fine." She didn't speak again, but when they reached the ranch and she climbed down from the wagon, she reached for his hand. Just brief, just once. And he held it before letting go. The trail west to the Sweetwater ran wide under a pale sky. The land stretched thin between ridges dusted with lingering snow. By the 4th day of travel, the wagon creaked with dust and wear, but the wheels held steady, and the mule kept her slow, sure pace. Flora sat beside Thatcher, her hands wrapped in leather gloves cut down to fit. A rifle rested between them, not from fear, but habit. They moved like a team now, their silence companionable, filled with glances and gestures that said more than words. At dusk, they made camp near a shallow bend in a river spanned by a broken footbridge. Flora knelt to gather dry moss from under a fir tree while Thatcher laid stones for the fire ring. When the flame caught, she turned a flatbread on the skillet, her brow lined in thought. "You ever think about building something bigger out there?" she asked, not looking up. "Past the ranch, I mean." He added another log to the fire, the bark catching with a hiss. "I've thought on it. Land near the high ridge has good soil. Would take work clearing it." She brushed ash from her skirt and settled back beside him. "What would you raise if it was yours to shape? Maybe more horses. Train some for trade. And wheat if water runs deep enough. Not just surviving, but putting something down that lasts." The fire snapped between them. She watched its light flicker along his jaw. "If we built something new, I'd want to be part of it." He turned toward her, his face still, voice low. "You already are." They didn't touch then, just sat with the truth of it, the way it settled around them like warmth from the fire. The next morning, frost hung in delicate threads from the tips of the grass, and the sky was clear enough to see all the way to the blue line of hills in the west. They reached the leasehold by midday, an old corral, fence leaning in places, a small shed with a roof of moss-damp shingles. 3 cattle moved slow through the field, ribs showing beneath their hides. Thatcher frowned. "They were fattened when I left. Someone's been letting them wander too far." He set to work checking the fence posts while Flora walked the ridge behind the shed, her boots crunching through thin ice. She found the track's first wolf, large, pressed deep. They circled near the northern fence line, then vanished into the brush. When she returned, Thatcher was hammering a new brace into place. "There's a den up behind the aspen stand," she said. "They've been coming close." He looked up, brow darkening. "Too close." They spent the afternoon repairing the fence, shoulders brushing as they passed tools back and forth. That night, they slept in the wagon bed, under thick quilts, the stars sharp above them. In the stillness of the hour before dawn, Flora whispered, "You ever think about marrying again?" He didn't move, just let the question rest a moment. "I did once," he said. "Wasn't time. I kept thinking I had more of it." She turned slightly, her breath visible in the chill. "What would it take now? To think there is time." He reached for her hand beneath the blanket. You, saying yes. She didn't answer, not in words. But she curled her fingers through his, and didn't let go. They stayed 2 more days, mending the shed roof, clearing brush, cutting salt blocks for the cattle. On the last evening, Thatcher brought out a small tin box from beneath the wagon seat. Inside was a ring, plain silver, worn smooth. My father gave it to my mother when they were younger than we are now, he said, watching her face. I don't have fine words, Flora, but I want you beside me, not just at the ranch, but in everything that's coming. She looked at the ring a long while. Then she took it, slid it onto her finger, and said, Then I reckon we've got building to do. They returned home under a sky turning soft with spring. The snow melted from the pastures, and the goats dropped their first kids on warm straw. By June, Thatcher had torn down the old shed beside the barn. Flora helped raise the beams for a new one, her shoulders strong now, her hair tied back beneath a sun-bleached scarf. The wedding was small, held at the edge of the pasture beneath the cottonwoods. Mrs. Eckhart brought wildflowers, and a neighboring preacher read from a worn book with the cover long gone. Thatcher wore his cleanest shirt. Flora wore blue calico and her mother's brooch pinned at the collar. After the vows, they shared a meal of roast hen and beans, and the neighbors left before the sun dipped too low. That night, under the same roof they'd shared through winter, Thatcher lit the lamp and reached for her hand. You sure? He asked, though he already knew. She leaned into him, her voice steady. I've never been more sure of anything. Years passed. They built the second pasture, then a smokehouse. Flora taught herself to read recipes from the almanac and wrote letters to a cousin she'd thought lost, who replied from a mining town in Colorado. Thatcher bred horses that fetched good money in Rawlins. And when their son was born one cold November, they named him Eli, after Flora's brother. They grew older with the land, the creases around their eyes deepening like lines on a well-worn map. But every night, as the fire burned low and the wind curled around the eaves, they reached for each other across the quilts, fingers twined, hearts steady, and they never let go.